So this weekend we're covering this Module 9 from the Discovering Buddhism program, and it's titled Samsara and Nirvana. So I thought it would be good to start by seeing where this module fits into the bigger picture, so we don't lose the forest for the trees. So as Shuki mentioned, this Discovering Buddhism program has 13 modules, and in the first module, those of you who attended the early modules, the mind, and it was titled Mind and Its Potential. So there you saw a little bit about the Buddhist theory of mind and the fact that within the Buddhist theory of mind, we can eliminate these mental afflictions in our mind, we can develop the positive qualities in our mind, and basically we can transform our mind. And then, of course, to be able to transform our mind, we need to meditate. And so that's Module 2, how to meditate, because merely gaining some intellectual understanding of Buddhist ideas is not really going to change much at all. We need to internalize these ideas. We need to meditate to bring that intellectual knowledge into experience so that we can really transform our mind. We can reduce and eliminate the mental afflictions, and we can develop the positive qualities. And then, of course, if we want to do that transformation, we need some structure. And so then that third module was called Presenting the Path. And of course, this Discovering Buddhism program is part of the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. And in the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism, the structure that's normally presented is called Lam Rim, Stages of the Path to Enlightenment. And so I'd like to present that because that reflects the modules that you do in the Discovering Buddhism program, of course. And then, of course, then we can see where this module we're doing this weekend, Samsara and Nirvana, where that fits in the overall structure. So then the stages of the path, the Lam Rim, of course, is the presentation that you would have got in that Module 3, Presenting the Path, in Discovering Buddhism Module 3. And in the Lam Rim presentation, the very first subject that you'll see is relying on a teacher. Because if we really want to effectively transform the mind and follow some path, we need guidance, we need help. And so that is then Module 4 that you looked at, the spiritual teacher, in terms of the qualities of the teacher and what to look for in a teacher and how to relate to the teacher. Of course, we can do something without a teacher, but we don't have unlimited time, so we want to really make our practice as effective as possible so the teacher can really guide us and help us avoid wasting a lot of time and going astray in the practice. And then on the basis of that, the next subject that we see in the Lam Rim is precious human life, is to reflect on the fact of we not only have a human existence, but we have a human existence full of opportunities and so forth. And the idea to reflect behind that is, of course, is that generally we don't tend to appreciate things until we've either lost them or are about to lose them. So it's very often in the case that we take our life for granted. We don't really make much out of our life, and then it's only later in our life we look back and we see that we really haven't done much with our life, and often then people are full of regrets later in life of having wasted their life. So by doing this reflection, we can appreciate the precious human life we have, full of opportunities, and we'll want to take advantage of it. But of course, if we've reflected on this and really appreciate that we've got a precious opportunity, we want to make our life meaningful, what do? How do we make our life meaningful? And here in the Lam Rim, that's set out in 3 stages or 3 levels of ability, called initial capacity, middling capacity, and great capacity. So therefore, at the initial level, how to make our life meaningful is simply to strive for a good future existence. Good future in this life, but of course, from a Buddhist perspective, also to strive for good future lives as well. How to do that? First, of course, we need to develop the aspiration to strive for a good future. And to help us to develop that aspiration, we reflect on death and impermanence. Because even though we may understand we have a precious human life and we want to make it meaningful, then often still people have this idea, okay, I wanted to make my life meaningful, but I'm busy now. I've got a career and family and all things to do. I'll do that spiritual stuff later, maybe when I retire or something. And of course we keep putting it off and off and off and we never begin. So this reflection on death and impermanence can really help us to develop that aspiration. And then also you'll find in the Lam Rim another topic, the potential future suffering, is to reflect on, based on what we're doing now with our life, what can we expect in the future? That if we're really engaging in a little bit harmful behavior, unethical behavior, we can expect probably a lot of suffering in the future. So by reflecting on these 2 points, we'll be able to develop the aspiration that we want to strive for a good future existence. But then, okay, we've developed that aspiration, and then that death and impermanence, of course, was, the module was Discovering Buddhism, Module 5, Death and Rebirth. But then, even if we've developed the aspiration to strive for a good future, what do we do? How do we do that? And of course, then we have 2 practices here, or 2 reflections. The first one was refuge. Who or what can we turn to for refuge to help us to avoid future suffering and to find a good future existence? And there, of course, in Discovering Buddhism Module 7, you looked at refuge in terms of refuge in the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. That we can turn to the Buddha for help because he's qualified. His teachings, the Dharma, gives us instructions on how to find a good future, and then the Sangha can help us implement that. And then how to implement that, or how to strive for a good future, is Discovering Buddhism Module 6 was all about karma. And so karma, of course, is the Buddhist presentation of law and of cause and effect in terms of our actions and our experiences. And by reflecting on karma, we can understand that if we want to avoid future suffering, we need to avoid harmful behavior. If we want a good future existence, we need to engage in virtuous behavior, positive actions. And so by reflecting on this, then that would inspire us to develop an ethical lifestyle. So basically, these practices here to help to strive for a good future would motivate us to adopt an ethical lifestyle, which of course is the basis of all Buddhist traditions, and I think it's the basis of any meaningful lifestyle, is to adopt that ethical lifestyle. So this is the person of initial capacity doing these sorts of reflections, thereby adopting an ethical lifestyle, and that will set us up very well for finding a good future existence. But of course, at this level of making our life meaningful, we can understand that, okay, maybe we can go a long way to making sure we have a good future existence, but we're still stuck in what's called samsara, this cycle of existence, life after life. And we're still prone to some suffering. So therefore, we can expand our motivation of making our life meaningful, of not just striving for a good future existence, but striving to break free of the whole cycle altogether. So then someone of middling capacity would be striving for the goal of nirvana, the goal of liberation from suffering altogether. And so of course this is the topic for this weekend, Discovering Buddhism Module 9, is Samsara and Nirvana. And so as we're going to see this weekend, first we need to develop the aspiration for Nirvana. And to develop the aspiration to strive for Nirvana, first we need to understand the situation we find ourselves in, which is suffering, or in Sanskrit, dukkha. And why are we stuck in this situation? Why are we stuck in this situation? And we can see here, as we're going to see this weekend, we're stuck here because we have mental afflictions. Our mind is contaminated, particularly contaminated by this fundamental ignorance, misunderstanding reality. And then also to help us understand how we are stuck in this cycle of existence called samsara, we have the 12 links presentation, which we'll also look at this weekend. And that's what's in this tanka here. And one of your handouts, of course, also has this diagram. And then based on this, reflecting on this, we can understand how we are stuck in this cycle of existence, but also how we can break free. And so then we will develop the aspiration to break free of this cycle, which usually again is translated as renunciation. So that's the aspiration for nirvana. But once we've developed the aspiration for nirvana, what do we need to do to actually achieve that goal? What are the practices? And as we're going to see, that the core practices are called the 3 higher trainings. Again, based on the ethical lifestyle that we've already cultivated at the initial level, on top of that we need to engage in the concentration practice, the shamatha practice, develop single-pointed concentration, and then we apply that into the vipassana practice, the wisdom practice, to come to realize the nature of reality and thereby overcome all mental afflictions and suffering and achieve the goal of nirvana. So this is the subject matter for this weekend, and that's Discovering Buddhism Module 9. So someone at this level can then go on to further reflect, well, I'm not the only one stuck in this cycle of samsara, so is everyone else. So I can expand my motivation of not only just wishing myself to be free of suffering, but wishing to help liberate everyone else from suffering. So then that is someone of great capacity. So someone of great capacity then is not simply striving for their own liberation, nirvana, but they're striving for the goal of enlightenment so that they can help liberate everyone else from suffering as well. And so, of course, first we need to develop the aspiration for enlightenment, which of course is called bodhicitta, and this is the next module you'll be covering, Discovering Buddhism Module 10, which is titled How to Develop Bodhicitta. And there you'll find that there are 2 main ways of developing the bodhicitta, 2 main methods taught, 7 cause and effect method and exchanging self with others. And so once we've developed this aspiration of bodhicitta, then of course we need to strive for the actual goal of enlightenment. So what practices do we need to engage in to strive for enlightenment? There, the presentation is the 6 perfections. And within the 6 perfections, of course, the wisdom within the 6 perfections is this wisdom of emptiness. And that is Module 12, Discovering Buddhism Module 12, is that within the 6 perfections, you're going to be looking at how to cultivate this wisdom of emptiness, because this is what we need to develop based on bodhicitta if we want to achieve enlightenment. But then in Module 13, you're going to be looking, it's titled Introduction to Tantra. And Tantra also comes within the same level, the person of great capacity striving for enlightenment. And the 2 practices there are called the 2 stages. And what you'll find in Module 13 is that in Tantra, these 2 stages practices enable us to tap into a deeper level of our mind, called the very subtle mind, the mind of clear light. And by being able to tap into that deeper level of our mind, we can accelerate the spiritual path to enlightenment, because that mind is more powerful than the level of mind we have currently access to now. And so therefore, based on the 6 perfections, if we engage in these 2 stages practices, level of Tantra, we can accelerate the path to enlightenment. So this is how the path is set out in the Geluk School of Tibetan Buddhism, and so this is more or less what you would have covered in that Module 3, Presenting the Path. And so this is where the topic that we are looking at this weekend fits. It's in this middling capacity, someone who's striving for the goal of nirvana. So is there any questions about any of that overview there? Anything not clear?
Regarding the 2 stages of the Tantra, we are not actually allowed to practice it without initiation, or am I mistaken?
Okay.
You have to go through another phase, no?
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. What I'd like to do now is based on this presentation. Have a look at that in terms of the three vehicles. And so that's where I'd like to answer that question. But if there's any other questions on the lamb rim structure, you can ask that now before we go to that presentation.
יש עוד תקליט?
יש.
Any questions about lamb rim structure? Everything clear? Because I think someone's answering a question about this, so particularly that person who's answering the question about the lamb rim, be good to have it clear in your mind now. Okay? Well, let's go to the three vehicles chart to have a look at how these three levels of practice in the lamb rim relate to these, what's called the three vehicles. So what we find, of course, within Buddhism is that the very first teaching the Buddha gave upon achieving enlightenment was the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths teaching is the Buddha's description of the situation we find ourselves in now, why we're in this situation, and how we can liberate ourselves from suffering. So the Four Noble Truths is effectively the teachings at this level that we are looking at this weekend, the someone of middling capacity. And so we see here in that the goal is Nirvana. And the vehicle here, sometimes you'll see the word Hinayana, but this level of practice is exemplified in the modern day world by the Theravada Buddhist traditions, because they are based on the Four Noble Truths teachings. So in these modern day Buddhist traditions, the Theravada traditions, which of course includes Sri Lankan Buddhism, Burmese, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, mainly Southeast Asian countries, in those countries, then the goal of the spiritual path is Nirvana. And these traditions were transmitted, the teachings were transmitted, spread from India through the Pali language. So when they go back to the original text, they'll be reading from the Pali scriptures. And so let's have a look at that vehicle. And we see, of course, that the goal of Nirvana here, this goal of personal liberation from suffering, if we achieve this goal of Nirvana, we are called an Arhat. And as we saw here, first we need to develop the aspiration to strive for Nirvana. And that aspiration is, in Sanskrit, Nisarana, which has been translated most commonly as renunciation. But this can be a little bit misleading, because here we're saying that this aspiration of renunciation is the entry point into the path to Nirvana. So it's often presented as the entry point into the Buddhist path. So often you hear people say, to really enter the Buddhist path, you need to develop renunciation. But then people, when they hear that, they misunderstand what that means based on the word renunciation. And so they think that somehow they have to renounce all of their worldly pleasures to be a good Buddhist. You know, I have to give up all my pleasurable things in life, that I have to run off and live in a cave or something. And then they think, oh, I don't want to be a Buddhist because I don't want to give up all the pleasures in my life. Of course, renunciation is not saying that at all. But the word renunciation, of course, means we need to give up something. That's true. but it's not about giving up pleasure. What renunciation is really saying is that what we need to give up is an unhealthy attitude towards those pleasures. Now, of course, we're pinning our hopes on pleasure as the source of our happiness. And from a Buddhist perspective, and if we think about it, that's just not going to work. It's just going to create a lot of suffering. Because pleasurable experiences are never going to fulfill us because they're stimulus-based experiences. They're just temporary, transient experiences. And if we develop craving and attachment towards them, we're just going to suffer a lot in terms of frustration when we don't get them, overindulgence and when we have too much and we suffer because of that, disappointment when they don't live up to our expectations and so forth. So therefore, what renunciation is saying is give up craving and attachment to pleasant experiences because it's not going to bring us anything, it's just going to bring us suffering. But the original word that is being translated as renunciation is nisarana. And that word nisarana we can divide into two. Ni is a prefix. It means sort of like, it means to get out of or away from. And sarana is the root, again, is sir, means to go or to move. So nisarana means to move away from, to get out of. So nisarana is the aspiration of wishing to move out of samsara, to move away from samsara. And of course, implicit in that is towards nirvana. And that word nisarana in Tibetan is ner chung. Ner chung. And ner means definite or certain, and chung means to emerge. So ner chung in Tibetan means to the mind, the aspiration of wishing to definitely emerge from samsara. So sometimes you'll find this word coming through Tibetan is translated as something like definite emergence. So when we see the word renunciation, that's what we need to keep in mind. It really means the aspiration, wishing to emerge from samsara towards the goal of nirvana. So it's basically the aspiration for liberation from suffering. But then, as we saw here, once we've developed this aspiration of renunciation, the aspiration to be liberated from suffering to achieve the goal of nirvana, then we need to engage in certain practices. And so here we see that in the Theravada traditions, based again on the Four Noble Truths, the standard presentation that you'll see is the Noble Eightfold Path. That there are these 8 practices that we need to engage in to achieve that goal of nirvana. And here we see that these 8 practices can be subsumed into 3 core areas of practice called these 3 higher trainings. So this right speech, right action, and right livelihood. So speech is verbal, action of course is physical, and livelihood is obvious, is way of living. These all are subsumed as ethics. And then we have right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. These are subsumed as the concentration practice. And then right view and right thought is the wisdom practice. So we see here that the 3 core areas of practice for achieving nirvana is ethics, concentration, and wisdom. And so what do we mean by the wisdom practice here? In Sanskrit, that is prajna, is another word for wisdom in Sanskrit is vipassana, or in Pali, vipassana. And in the word vipassana, or the Pali word vipassana, vi means higher or superior, and Pashana or Pasana means to see. So Vipassana or Vipassana practice means higher seeing or seeing beyond or superior seeing. And often Vipassana or Vipassana is translated into English as insight or special insight. And so what we're talking about, of course, is gaining insight into the nature of reality. And here in the Theravada traditions, when we talk about Vipassana practice, we're talking about gaining three particular insights, here called the three marks of existence. So the three insights we're trying to cultivate in the Theravada is the insight into impermanence, suffering, or in other words, dukkha, and insight into no self. So impermanence, of course, here is the insight into the fact that things are changing moment by moment. Here we need to be a little bit careful as well with the terminology, because often you'll see in Buddhism the word impermanence and permanent, permanent and impermanent. And normally when we talk about that in general, often when we use the word permanent and impermanent, permanent is something that lasts forever and impermanent is something that doesn't last forever. That's not the meaning of the words here. Literally coming from the Tibetan, the word is changing and unchanging. So the word impermanent or permanent in Buddhism is not telling us how long something lasts. All it's telling us is this phenomena changing from one moment to the next or not? If it is, it's impermanent. If it's not, it's permanent. So there are many things that are impermanent that last forever, and there are things that are permanent that last a very short time. For example, our mind is impermanent, but it lasts forever. So we need to be a little bit careful then when we see these words. So impermanent here just means, is this thing changing from one moment to the next? It's not telling us how long it exists. But you may say, and we're talking here about gaining this insight into impermanence, but you say, well, I know that already. I know that everything's changing moment by moment. I learnt that at school. The scientists have proven that everything is changing moment by moment. I know that. So why do I need to do that here? So remember, Vipassana practice is not gaining intellectual knowledge. Vipassana practice is insight, experiential insight, because our behavior is not driven by our intellectual understanding. Again, I think all of us here intellectually accept that everything we experience is changing moment by moment. I think none of us have a problem with that. Yet, is that how we relate to things experientially? Do we relate to things as if they're changing moment by moment? And I think the answer is definitely no. We relate to things as if this phone is basically the same phone that was here yesterday, it'll be the same phone tomorrow. And then, of course, if suddenly it breaks or something, we get frustrated and upset because we were expecting it not to change. So what we need to do is we need to bring that intellectual understanding of impermanence into experience through meditation. We need to meditate and we need to experientially realize impermanence in meditation. We need to have a direct insight into impermanence in meditation. If we have that direct insight into impermanence in meditation, it means that will penetrate our mind very deeply. It means when we get out of that meditation, our mind is still affected by that experience, which means now, in our daily life, experientially, we'll see things as changing moment by moment. And that's going to have a profound impact on our behavior. Because, again, we tend to see things as quite stable and static. And then, of course, if we experience something and we have a pleasant experience, we go, oh, that's very nice, I like that, I want that, and we try and hold on to it. So we have a lot of craving and attachment for it. Or if it's unpleasant, we push against it and we have aversion. But if we're experientially seeing things everything we experience as changing moment by moment, what is there to grab and what is there to push away against? Nothing there, because it's changing. So you'll find if you have an insight into impermanence, and that's still affecting your mind outside of meditation, you will find in your daily life much less craving and attachment to pleasant things, much less aversion to unpleasant things. Your life will already be dramatically improved, dramatically. And that's just impermanence. That's just the first insight. Then the second one, insight into suffering or dukkha, that's something we're going to be looking at over the weekend in some detail. By having that insight, it really means we'll realize, not again intellectually, maybe many of us here already intellectually understand the source of happiness and suffering is not out there, it's in our mind. Maybe we accept that already, but is that really helping us in our daily life? Or are we still chasing after happiness out there and seeing the source of that person is causing me suffering, you know? That's how we behave. So if we realize dukkha, that's going to shift dramatically. Experientially, we'll see that. And then we'll really have this, we'll be able to develop this aspiration of renunciation then. So that second insight into suffering or dukkha is the basis for developing this renunciation or nissarana. So without realizing dukkha, I think renunciation is not going to happen, because we're still going to be looking out there for happiness and source of suffering. And then, of course, the wisdom of no self, the realization of no self, which we'll also be looking at tomorrow, is what's going to help us to overcome mental afflictions and suffering. Because the Buddhist assertion is that, or at least in the Theravada, is that we have a false sense of me. Again here, what we're saying is that the me, there's no me here that is more than the body and the mind. And maybe many of us already understand that intellectually, that there's nothing more than the body and the mind here. But that's not how we see ourselves. We're grasping onto this self. Instinctively, we sense or we have a feeling there's a me here. Definitely there's a me here that's something more than just the body and the mind. That's how we see ourselves instinctively. There's no such self. And if we can bring that understanding into experience, we realize that, that's the basis of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. And if we can realize there's no such self, we can achieve nirvana. So this is very briefly the Vipassana practice, or within the Theravada level of practice. So there was a question over here before, earlier.
You say that there are things that are constant and stay for a second. What is it, understanding emptiness, for example?
Of course, the classic example of permanent is emptiness. And of course, emptiness is not floating in the air somewhere. Emptiness is a quality of a phenomena. So if that phenomena, when that phenomena comes into existence, the emptiness of that phenomena comes into existence. And when that phenomena goes out of existence, the emptiness goes out of existence. So if that phenomena lasts for a short time, the emptiness lasts a very short time. Any questions about this before we now look at the Mahayana? So of course this level is what we're looking at in detail this weekend in terms of renunciation, nirvana, the practices and so forth. Okay. Yeah.
Did you give an example of something that is not changed?
Yeah, emptiness is the classic example. There's another example that...
Awareness, no? And the awareness?
Awareness is changing moment by moment. Basically, one of the assertions is that anything that is created by causes and conditions is necessarily impermanent.
But the awareness,
Has causes and conditions. Because the awareness that exists in this moment is caused by the awareness from the previous moment, plus the various conditions that were around that time. Like, for example, now we have an awareness, and maybe my awareness is observing this laptop, for example. But then in this very moment, there are a lot of conditions around, which means that awareness that is observing the laptop, due to some various conditions, in the next moment becomes an awareness looking outside or thinking about something. So it's causes and conditions.
And the knowing itself is changing. The core of knowing.
What is that? What is the core of
Yeah, knowing is a quality, yeah. I mean, does the fact that the mind have the quality of knowing change? Does it sometimes have knowing and not? No. But we're talking about the phenomena itself, the mind is changing moment by moment. I mean, we're not talking about whether or not some quality is there in one moment and in the next moment it's not there. We're talking about the phenomena itself.
impermanence? Impermanence is permanent.
Yeah, I mean, again, the fact that things are impermanent is not changing, but impermanence itself, the quality or the phenomena is changing, yes.
Glen,
Yeah.
since emptiness is permanent, as we said, isn't it not due to the causal condition? For example, the emptiness of myself is due to my changing moment to moment and the causal condition of being me? Or?
No, you don't. A phenomena doesn't create its emptiness. When the phenomena comes into existence, simultaneously with that, the emptiness of that phenomena comes into existence. It's not causing it.
It's not causing it.
No. Anyway, that's something we'll look at maybe later. Right, so let's have a look at the Mahayana now. So Mahayana here is then great capacity, equivalent to great capacity. Because in the Mahayana, the goal of the spiritual path is enlightenment, which in Sanskrit, of course, is bodhi. And we saw here that to strive for enlightenment, we need to develop the aspiration of bodhicitta. And someone who's developed the aspiration of bodhicitta is called a bodhisattva. So bodhicitta, of course, is a Sanskrit word. So the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, and that, of course, includes things like Chinese Buddhism, Zen, Korean, Vietnamese, Tibetan, Mongolian. These traditions are based on the original Sanskrit Buddhist tradition. And in these traditions, the goal of the spiritual path, the final goal, is the goal of enlightenment. And to strive for the goal of enlightenment, we develop the aspiration of bodhicitta. So bodhi is enlightenment, of course. Chitta means mind. So bodhicitta is literally the mind of enlightenment, the mind aspiring to enlightenment. And when we develop the aspiration of bodhicitta, we are called a bodhisattva. So again, bodhi is enlightenment. Sattva here means courage or strength. So a bodhisattva is someone who has the courage or strength to strive for enlightenment. And then, of course, if we want to strive for enlightenment, we need to engage in certain practices. And so here we have the 6 perfections, are the normal presentation for the practices to strive for the goal of enlightenment. We see them listed there: generosity, ethics, patience, joyous effort, concentration, and wisdom. But like the Noble Eightfold Path, these 6 perfections we can also condense into the same 3 core areas of practice, of ethics, concentration, wisdom. Because we can put generosity, ethics, and patience in ethics. And then we have concentration and wisdom there, and joyous effort is something we need to apply to all areas of practice. So also the 6 perfections can be subsumed into the same 3 core areas of practice, of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. And so again here, the wisdom practice, another name for that, is the Vipassana practice. But here in the Mahayana, when we talk about Vipassana practice, we're mainly talking about the practice of emptiness. The realization that there's no independent me, no independent world. That everything is empty of independent existence. Nothing exists independently. And in Sanskrit, the word emptiness is shunyata. So here, in Mahayana Vipassana practice, mainly we're talking about gaining this wisdom of emptiness, because the Mahayana assertion is that if we realize nothing exists independently, that is the fundamental ignorance we're trying to overcome, that everything, we're grasping onto the fact that everything is existing independently. If we can realize nothing exists independently, we can overcome all mental afflictions and suffering. And then on the basis of the aspiration of bodhicitta and that emptiness practice together, we can achieve the goal of enlightenment. But then we also have here the Vajrayana. And Vajrayana sometimes is called Tantra. And here we see in the Vajrayana or Tantra, the goal is the same, the goal of enlightenment. We have to develop the same aspiration of bodhicitta and the same Vipassana practice of emptiness. So what's different between Mahayana and Vajrayana? What's different is that in Vajrayana or Tantra, we are gaining access to a deeper level of our mind. A level of mind called the very subtle mind, or sometimes called the mind of clear light. The mind that we have now that's active is called coarse mind. And our coarse mind, as you probably... Coarse, yeah. As you probably saw in Module 1, Mind and its Potential, that coarse mind is very untrained, a lot of mental afflictions, distraction, dullness. And so what we need to do, of course, is train that coarse mind. And that's what we're doing in the Theravada Mahayana. We're using the concentration practice, the shamatha practice, to train the coarse mind, to subdue it, to make it more calm, more clear, more focused, a little bit more subtle. And then we use that little bit more subtle mind, a more stable mind, as the basis of our Vipassana practice. And then we move slowly along the path to either Nirvana or enlightenment. But this takes a long time. Whereas Vajrayana or Tantra are helping us to go much deeper level of mind, to get to the deepest level of mind, called the very subtle mind, or sometimes called the mind of clear light. And how to gain access to that very subtle mind and then use it are these two stages practices. The generation stage practice is to help us to have a good basis for being able to then access that very subtle mind in the completion stage. And generation stage level of practice often involves doing what's called sadhana, a practice manual. And so in the sadhana practice, often that involves a lot of visualization, visualizing ourselves in a fully enlightened form and reciting mantras and doing other various things. But that generation stage practice at the most subtle level involves developing a high level of concentration. So at the more subtle level of generation stage practice, it's really a shamatha practice, concentration practice. And then we are using that to gain access to the very subtle mind. And we do that through the completion stage practice. Completion stage practice is a lot about manipulating what's called the subtle body. And the subtle body, of course, we talk about channels and chakras and subtle energies flowing through these channels. And in completion stage practice, we are trying to withdraw all of those subtle energies into what's called the central channel and trying to dissolve them into what's called the heart chakra. And by dissolving all these subtle energies into the heart chakra, that causes the heart chakra to open, and that causes the very subtle mind to become manifest. And then we use that very subtle mind to realize emptiness. And if we can use that very subtle mind to realize emptiness, because it's much more powerful mind, that realization of emptiness now based on the very subtle mind can wipe out ignorance and mental afflictions much more quickly. We can accelerate to the path to enlightenment. Now, a couple of differences between Theravada, Mahayana and Vajrayana. Both Theravada and Mahayana level or vehicles are often called causal vehicles. Causal. Meaning they are looking at the spiritual path from the perspective of the cause. Meaning, here we are now, this is where we are now, there is the goal Nirvana, there is the goal enlightenment, these are the practices that I need to engage in to create the causes to achieve that goal. So we're looking forward on the spiritual path from where we are. So they're called causal vehicles. Whereas Vajrayana is called resultant vehicle, meaning Vajrayana has the complete opposite perspective. We are viewing the spiritual path from the perspective of the fully enlightened state. And we are doing all the practices from that perspective. And that's a very powerful approach. And this approach is sometimes used, for example, in sport. You know, someone who's going to engage in some sporting activity imagines going through their routine and having achieved the final goal, and then on that basis they engage in that activity, and that really helps to better achieve that goal. Similarly, in Vajrayana, the whole practice is done from the fully enlightened state, from that perspective. But to be able to do that, we need some prerequisites. In fact, when we look at these three vehicles, what we can understand is they're not three different roads. It's not like, which one will I choose? That's not the right understanding. These are not three different roads. They are three levels of practice. And each one is the basis of the next level. So, you know, to think, oh, I'm a Mahayana person, you know, this is superior to those Theravada things. I won't do that Theravada stuff. I mean, that's a wrong thinking. It's not going to work. And similarly, you may look and you think, oh, that Vajrayana Tantra, that looks interesting. That looks like exciting sort of stuff. All that Mahayana and Theravada, that looks like just a lot of hard work and boring stuff. So I'll skip all of that. I'm just going to do the Tantra Vajrayana because that looks really exciting. And it's the shortcut. It's the shortcut. I don't want to do all this work. I want the shortcut to enlightenment. And that's sometimes what people do. And we see that when particularly through Tibetan Buddhism, which of course has all the levels of practice embedded in it, you know, then when Tibetan Buddhism came into the Western countries 40, 50, 60 years ago, then people go, oh yeah, that Tantra, I like that. And so then they took all these empowerments, initiations, and doing their sadhana practice every day, and then 10 years later, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. It's because they don't have the basis. It's just a game then. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, I want the third floor penthouse, but I don't want the first two floors. Don't build them. I just want the third floor penthouse.
The view.
Yeah, I want the view from the third floor penthouse, but don't build the first two floors. I mean, that's not going to work, is it? You need the first two floors to have the third floor penthouse. Similarly, if we want to practice Vajrayana or Tantra, we need the basis. And what's the basis is three things. Of course, we need renunciation. If we don't have renunciation, then Tantra just becomes another way of craving and attachment for pleasurable experiences. It just becomes a bliss game. It's just a game. So we need renunciation. Otherwise, no chance is going to work. And then, of course, we need bodhicitta, because otherwise there's no way we're going to get to enlightenment without bodhicitta. And then, of course, with bodhicitta, we need the wisdom of emptiness. Particularly here, even from the very beginning in Tantra Vajrayana, we need emptiness. In Mahayana, of course, we build up, we're looking forward, so we need to engage in these practices step by step, and at some point we'll come to the wisdom emptiness practice. But in Vajrayana, we need emptiness from the very beginning, from day one. There is no way you can practice Tantra without the wisdom of emptiness from the very beginning. Because we are practicing Vajrayana from the enlightened perspective. And so maybe some of you already have some sadhana practice. And the very first thing you see in the sadhana practice is dissolve yourself into emptiness, arise as the deity. And then of course people go, oh yeah, I can do that. And then they're like, okay, now I'm pretending to be Tara. Now I'm pretending to be Chenrezig. Or now I'm pretending to be whoever. If this is what we're doing, we're just wasting our time. Because all we're doing is we're changing one form of grasping. Instead of grasping onto this as me, now we're grasping onto Tara or Chenrezig as me. And that's potentially more delusional. Because then we're being completely delusional instead of just half delusional. And of course, if we're grasping onto Tara and Chenrezig as me, I'm enlightened, I'm better than everyone else. Everything I do is with wisdom, so I can do whatever I like. Disaster, absolute disaster. The only way we can really begin to practice Tantra is if we have some understanding and experience of emptiness. There's no way otherwise we can do this practice. So dissolving into emptiness, arising to the deity, requires an understanding and experience of emptiness. Without that, we can't do it. We can't do it. So if we really want to practice Tantra Vajrayana, we need those three things. Do we have to have a direct realization of bodhicitta, a direct realization of emptiness? No. Do we need to have some understanding and experience? Yes. Without that, it's just a game that's not going to get us anywhere and potentially just create more delusion. And I know people who, from particularly the early days of Tibetan Buddhism in the 60s, 70s and 80s, going to India and getting all these empowerments, and then every day they're reciting their sadhanas day in, day out, and 10 years later nothing has changed. Nothing. And often they just give up because they see that they haven't changed, they haven't improved as a person. So we need the basis. If we have the basis, then Tantra is, yes, powerful and it can accelerate. But without the basis, it's not going to do anything except just waste our time and maybe make ourselves more delusional than we are already. Okay. A couple more things to say, but maybe if there's a couple of quick questions and then it's time for morning tea break.
You mentioned different countries that engage in the different levels.
Yeah.
So they don't get to the
Right.
mantra?
So, no, because what happened was that initially, of course, the Buddha, the main thing he taught was the Four Noble Truths on that level, and that's what started to spread through India widely. And then in the early days of Buddhism that's what spread to Sri Lanka, and then up through Burma, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and so forth. The Mahayana idea wasn't taught so widely, and it took a bit longer to sort of spread in India. And that's when Buddhism spread over the Himalayas onto the Silk Route, into China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam. So in those countries, mainly then Mahayana. And then Vajrayana only really started to take hold in India around the 8th century onwards, 7th, 8th century onwards. And by that time, Buddhism had spread to most countries except Tibet. Buddhism only started to spread to Tibet in the 8th century. And by that time, Vajrayana was really starting to be widely practiced in India. So what spread to Tibet was all of that, including Vajrayana or Tantra. Whereas for most other countries, Buddhism had already spread to those countries prior to that. Okay, let's take morning tea break and come back at 11:15.